Okay, hello everyone and welcome to this Institute for Government event, How are Public Services Performing Across the Country? And a big thanks to Grant Thornton for making this event possible. I'm Emma Norris, I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute for Government. So we've got just under 3 weeks to go until the general election. It feels like it's been going on a very long time already. Public services are a key battleground. The NHS is consistently cited in surveys as one of the top two issues facing the country. Social care and schools have played a critical role in deciding recent elections. We've seen public services right at the heart of the promises that parties are making, both in the run-up to the election, in pledges and first steps for government. Most recently in the manifestos, both Conservatives and Labour have made promises committing to more police officers or neighbourhood police officers, both committing to cutting NHS waiting lists. I think something that's come out really strongly in the kind of analysis and dialogue around the election so far is there a sense that some of the toughest choices on public services are yet to come. We published a report last week called The Precarious State of the State, which showed just how bad things are right now. Record waiting lists in the NHS, full prisons, teacher retention and recruitment crises in schools, and yet spending plans at the moment look really bleak. Indeed, over the weekend, Nuffield, a leading health think tank, said that Labour and the Conservatives would both leave the NHS with lower spending increases than during the years of Tory austerity if they stick to current plans. So what impact are public services likely to have on the election campaign? What kind of choices is the next government going to have to confront in office? And what does the public think about all this? What are their preferences and what can they live with? I've got a fantastic panel here to talk about this with me. Nick Davies, the Public Services Director at the Institute for Government. Zoe Grunewald, who's the Westminster Editor of the Lead UK and a freelance political journalist and broadcaster. Gideon Skinner, who's the Head of Politics and Public Affairs at Ipsos UK. And Philip Woolley, who's partner at Grant Thornton. So the way we're going to run this event is we'll have opening statements from each of the panellists. Then I've got a few questions that I'm going to follow up with, and then I'll open it up to the audience. I'll give people an opportunity to ask questions in the room. If you're online, welcome, and you can ask questions anytime from now. You should have a link to Slido on the page, so just ask questions now, and I'll make sure that I ask some of those when we get to Q&A as well. Okay, so I think, Nick, I'm going to come to you first.
Thanks, Emma. I'm just going to start by giving a quick rundown of the overarching picture on public service performance. So across the key services that we look at between 2010 and the eve of the pandemic, almost all of those had got worse, either in terms of the quality of service or of access to that service, with particularly big declines in performance in hospitals, adult social care, and prisons. And that was just before the pandemic. And then since the eve of the pandemic until now, so over the course of this parliament, most services are again performing worse now than they were 5 years ago, with again hospitals seeing a big further decline in performance, and probably criminal courts being the other area where performance has got substantially worse, with big backlogs in cases in both. Indeed, across the services we look at, schools are the only one that are arguably performing better now than they were in 2010. And as Emma mentioned, current spending plans, which go until 2028-29, on our analysis would see most of those services still performing worse at the end of that period than they are now, and therefore than they were on the eve of the pandemic. I think in hospitals, both main parties have committed to implementing the NHS long-term workforce plan, which implies 3.6% spending increases per year, quite a lot. Even with that, due to workforce issues, productivity issues, it's unclear how much a bigger improvement in performance you would see as a result of that additional investment. In local government, you would see much of the same trend as we've seen in recent years, with cuts to the central government grant being partially offset by raising council tax, but that not being enough to meet growing demand, and therefore local authorities having to further cut back kind of universal preventative services, and even to ration some of the acute services that they're responsible for as well. And the situation in criminal justice, particularly in courts and prisons, it's pretty much impossible to imagine how it might remotely work, given that particularly in prisons, the government is already implementing emergency measures, and the idea that you could make substantial cuts while the prison population is expected to grow, it's unrealistic at best. So given all of those problems, what do I think probably the biggest challenges facing the incoming government are? Probably prisons. They're going to have to make some very unpalatable decisions very quickly, just as the current government is. Hospital productivity, whether they like it or not, the NHS is the single biggest public service. It's the one that we spend the most money on, and the government is going to be judged on what happened to elective, A&E and cancer waiting times. And then probably also the financial sustainability of local authorities. We've had a number provide Section 114 notices, which is the equivalent of local authority bankruptcy. It's not quite bankruptcy. Most of those, there have been problems with the management of those local authorities, but there are scores of other local authorities that are on the brink that have been doing as well as could be expected. And I think that situation is likely to get a lot worse over the next year. And then just finally, just to note a kind of distribution of performance. In general, performance is worse in more deprived parts of the country. Generally, demand is higher, it is more complex, and the services are less well funded. So, for example, in deprived areas, GPs have more patients, which means worse continuity of care, which means worse quality of care. The local authorities in more deprived areas saw the biggest cuts to their central government grants, particularly between 2010 and 2015. And schools in the most deprived areas tend to have the lowest exam results, and pupils there show the lowest amount of progress. So whoever wins the next election, they're going to have a lot on their plate.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. Gideon, I want to come to you now. So Nick's outlined the state of services at the moment, some of the kind of most difficult choices that are facing the incoming government, and how some of those that performance is kind of expressed at a local level. What do we know about polling on public services at the moment?
So we know very much this is not the 2019 election. The 2019 election was the Brexit election, and it is not that. I mean, one way that we can think about it is call it the dissatisfaction election. Or the disaffection election. And there are lots of things going on in that. That's partly economy, cost of living, of course. It's immigration, although border control is a public service. But a big factor underlying that dissatisfaction is a real kind of crisis of confidence in public services. We find 3 in 4 people telling us that public services have got worse over the last 5 years. And the trouble for the Conservatives in an election point of view is that is it's just as high, in fact, if not higher, in some of their own Conservative-held seats. So it's a pretty widespread held view, and that is kind of feeding through into, as you said, Emma, the kind of like the issues that are driving people's vote in the election. It's, the NHS is top, and we've seen NHS high before, but it feels slightly different this time, that it does seem a bit more intense, the level of concern about NHS, about things like waiting lists. And it would not be surprising to see sort of maybe education or some other public services come up. And of course, that all helps Labour as well, because public services on NHS, on education, on housing, on things like that are a Labour strength. And now they're combining that with getting a lead on some of the more competence measures like tax and spend as well. So they've got a good package there for Labour. And if we're looking at some of the individual services that explain that crisis of confidence, we've asked about a whole range of services, and we get recycling services that just about get half of people satisfied with them, but like everything else is really, really low. It goes down to 7% satisfaction for road maintenance, which is maybe why Labour's doing stuff on potholes. But you pick out key ones like 23% satisfied with the police, 38% satisfied with GPs, 31% satisfied with NHS hospitals, 44% of parents satisfied with their secondary schools. And all of those are just a long way behind the types of satisfaction scores we've seen in the past, even just a few years ago. And we see that playing across regional inequalities as well, like particularly bad in the north of England, in kind of the sort of quote-unquote red wall, industrial, traditional mining areas. We see different types of inequality, so that London is really concerned about the police, but happy with transport. Parts of the north are really unhappy with the NHS and so on. So you see it playing out in these individual public services, but just as worrying, I think, is the change in the wider image of public services that the public have got. Where if we go back to maybe at least the early years of austerity, people broadly bought into that, but actually we saw public satisfaction with public services maintaining and sort of holding up, and it's difficult to prove, but it feels like maybe that's around kind of some people's expectations have changed. But now we've seen some of that goodwill go, and so there's one question, and we ask people, what words would you associate with public services? And you always get underfunded at the top, right? Everyone always thinks public services are underfunded. But when we asked it, like in 1998, we first asked this question, and you had better things like being friendly and hardworking and keen to help and open. Those words are now much less likely to be picked. More, it's things like bureaucratic, unaccountable, unresponsive, even infuriating. So we're worrying that some of those, it's not just about unhappiness with individual public services, but maybe it's affecting sort of just general people perceptions of public services. So it does mean, as Nick said, it's going to be very hard for any government to turn that around. Most people tell us that they think it will take at least 10 years for things to get better. And this new government's going to have to both turn around some of those sort of bread and butter issues like availability, access, sort of levels of quality and so on, but also deal with some of those broader issues that the public are concerned around like fairness, accountability, how you engage with the public, how you take into account sort of local and place-based decisions, how do you restructure public services maybe on a mission-based approach to sort of overcome silos, which does mean it's going to be really, really difficult to turn some of these concerns around.
Thank you, Gideon. There was just one thing I wanted to pick up on that you said there, which is that, of course, during an election campaign, public services kind of rating really highly is in some ways good for Labour because they're a party that's more associated with, kind of supporting public services in some ways. But does that mean actually it's worse for Labour in office because expectations of what a Labour government might achieve on public services are that bit higher than a Conservative?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be one of the key questions. You might expect, normally there is some sort of honeymoon. You probably don't expect a kind of like a 1997 style honeymoon, and you might just expect that just to feed through into people's perceptions. Labour supporters are a bit more optimistic about the future of public services, probably because they think their party is more likely to win in the election. So there might just be a bit of a halo effect at first. But yes, there's some, we all know that there are some kind of deep-seated, difficult decisions to take on public services, and turning around, as I say, both those sort of immediate bread and butter delivery issues, but also some of those wider points. So no, it's not going to be easy.
Thank you. Philip, to you.
Okay, so I can give you a perspective, I guess, from myself and colleagues who are sort of working in and around public services. And I think, as we've heard already, there's a general recognition, really, that public services don't feel as though they're really working for people at the moment. I think even what's quite startling in this election, I think, is even the current government aren't claiming that public services are working well. And in terms of addressing some of those challenges, I like the phrase that IFG used in their tracker last year, a sort of doom loop, which is a really depressing term, but sort of describes perfectly, I think, right across the full spectrum of public services, the range of interrelated issues that both of the major parties are not really addressing themselves to. One, I guess, because for the Conservatives it points to a sort of record of failure potentially, but for Labour, perhaps the scale of the challenge, they can't really be open about that because it'll cast further sort of light and questions around the fiscal challenge that they face. So some of the debate feels rather artificial, I think, at the moment, in terms of some of the interventions that will be required to get public services back on a firmer footing. And when we work across local government, NHS, transport, we're seeing a range of challenges that we've not seen before. So local authorities going bust. So that looks like the whole sort of recapitalisation of the sector, together with a complete overhaul of the funding framework for local government. There's going to be a real sort of spatial and devolution dynamic to that, as Nick says. The places that are struggling most tend to be in the north of England, not just the north of England though, but where economic performance tends to be, local economic performance tends to be weakest. But our modelling indicates there's a £6 billion funding gap to be addressed between income and expenditure in local government. In NHS, massive challenges around waiting lists, workforce, etc. But again, the sort of rhetoric you would hear for government doesn't really speak to the underlying challenges in addressing those issues. It's more framed in terms of retail offers around X number of appointments, these sorts of inputs, not really the systemic change that will be required to sort of address that. One key point, just before I finish, is around capital investment, I think. The scale of capital investment that's going to be required to unlock some productivity gains, you're not really hearing that talked about in this campaign very much. So we're hearing lots about the sort of financial forecast, but not around capital. And the capital forecasts are really modest and don't appear to be up to the scale of the challenge. So it's public services facing really acute challenges. And I think post-election, the next government is going to have to be really open about that, I think.
Brilliant, thank you, Philip. I want to talk a bit more about capital when we get into discussion, but Zoe, I want to come to you first.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the panel. It's a pleasure. I was trying to think about how I could add some value to this conversation as a political journalist, because I'm not an economist and I'm not an expert on public sector policy, but I think we can all agree that the intersection of public services and politics has never been kind of more pronounced right now. As everyone on the panel has said, public services are going to be a really key theme in this election, but not just about who wins the election, but how we assess their success, the success of the next government when they win. I think it's worth saying that Brits are inherently pretty statist. We like our public services. We like them to function well. We support public spending. We tend to be pro-welfare. It's often said in this country that the NHS is the closest thing we have to a religion. But over the years, that relationship's been tested. We've seen austerity programmes, which have been mass cuts in welfare spending. School building programmes have been cancelled. There's been reductions in local government funding, cuts to the police, courts, prisons, and public confidence in those services has really decreased as a result. There's also a massive crisis of trust in our government at the minute and in politicians. And these two intersect. We saw during COVID all the scandals about the use of public funds and government contracts. We've seen cancelled levelling up programmes. When you talk to voters on the doorsteps, these two things go hand in hand. They see failures in public services as a reason why they can't trust politicians anymore. So in terms of how this is all going to play out at a general election, I'd say there's three sort of core themes. The first is the health service, and this has always been the case in every election. But particularly in this one, it's the debate about spending versus reform. Waiting lists have risen to 7.5 million. Sickness is dominating the conversation around the economy and productivity. We've got 2.8 million people currently not working due to long-term sickness in the UK. We also don't have a fully functioning social care system, which means that we really can't address the issues in the NHS without it, yet there seems to be a conspiracy of silence from the two main parties about what actually happens when it comes to adult social care. The second big issue is immigration. Now, we can debate as to whether this is actually reasonably a big issue at this election. But the reason lots of voters talk about it is because they are worried about further constraints on public services. Now, I'm sure we'll get onto that. Some people would argue that actually immigration is a huge net positive for our public services. We get lots of staff who are immigrants, and of course, immigrants tend to pay more in tax, which helps fund our public services. But either way, there's a perception issue here, where lots of members of the public are worried that their already overstretched public services will be stretched more unless immigration is cut. And that brings me to my last point, which is the big question of how governments will pay for public services. Now, I spoke about a conspiracy of silence over social care. There's also a conspiracy of silence, as Paul Johnson from the IFS said, over how governments will pay for the kind of demands that the rest of the panel have set out. Labour, who is likely to win, I think we can all probably agree on that, have said that they are going to stick with the current set of fiscal rules, so they're not going to borrow anymore. They've said they're not going to put up taxes. They've left some scope for conversation about whether there might be wealth taxes, but either way, there seems to be this multi-billion-pound black hole in how we're going to pay for these things. So the big questions for any incoming government is how they're going to restore faith in public services, and to do that, they have to address these issues one way or another. Getting into government is one thing, but as the rest of the panel have set out, there's so many more questions to come and so many more challenges to come when the party looks at the books and sees the scale of the issue. It's going to be really difficult. The one ray of hope is that if we are seeing, if what we are seeing when it comes to Labour, for example, getting a big majority, is that this gives them more scope to make difficult decisions and get that kind of mandate to push them through. They're also talking about a 10-year plan, so that implies 2 electoral terms. That way you can think much more long-term about the sort of change that is needed in this country. But it's not going to be easy. And as has already been said, the public are going to judge them very, very quickly on whether they're actually making the sort of change they have set out. So lots of difficult decisions await an incoming government, and the public are, I would say, running out of patience.
Thank you, Zoe. I think we can agree on that. Gideon's analysis was clear that the public really care about public services, and at the moment they're incredibly dissatisfied. As you say, both parties have said very little actually on spending commitments, on how they're going to raise anything like the revenue that's needed to try and turn a corner on performance. So we know there are these really difficult choices facing the next government, probably a Labour government. But how do you think that's actually going to play out in office? What might we see a new government do to try and square that circle?
So Labour have ruled out an array of sort of personal tax rises. So they say they're not going to put up income tax. They've ruled out VAT tax hikes. They've talked about some ways they're going to generate revenue. So they're going to close the non-dom tax loophole. They're talking about scrapping VAT for private schools. They're going to collect more in windfall tax from oil and gas companies. But that's actually only quite a small amount of revenue, really. The rest they're hoping will be done through productivity savings, which sounds great and sounds like a magic bullet, but I think anybody who knows about government and how difficult and technical these things are will know that will take a lot of time and a lot of personnel to actually see through. So they have sort of left themselves open for a couple of other things. So there's, I think today or maybe over the weekend, they ruled out any change to the council tax system. But what is still being discussed is wealth taxes in some form. So, for example, capital gains tax is talked about as something that could be a lever that the Labour Party would pull should they need to. I think basically what they are hoping is when they get into government and they take a look at the books and they see what the state of public finances are, they might be then able to go to the public and say, actually, we've taken a look and we are going to need to raise some new funds quite quickly from somewhere. Here are the options open to us. But saying that before, the country go to the polls in 2 or 3 weeks is risky, and it's been something that Labour have been very politically problematic for them in the past. So I think they're hoping that there will be room with all the things they've kind of set out already and productivity savings and the rest of it to start implementing that kind of change. They're also seeking a lot of private investment. They want to generate growth, but I think the reality is that there will be some tax rises on the horizon, and they will probably try and pull those wealth tax levers rather than personal taxes.
Thank you. Gideon, I want to stick with Zoe's point on, will the new government feel the need to kind of go to the public and explain some of these difficult choices? Now, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think polls often show at least that members of the public are willing to pay higher taxes in exchange for better public services. And how prepared do you think the public really are for some of the choices that are facing the next government? Do you think they would really be prepared to pay more in some form? And is there any chance that the next government will actually ask them to?
As long as they don't go to the public by calling another election. Most of the public, the public are a bit split on this, as you would expect. Most of the public do think that taxes are going up. Half of people think taxes are going to go up, whether it's the Conservatives or Labour. who win. The difference is that they are most likely to think that if Labour get in, then spending will go up, whereas they don't think that would happen under the Conservatives. And for many people supporting Labour, you sort of feel that's a positive. So, you know, there's a sort of, there's I don't know if it's sort of, I've got data to show this, but you sort of maybe feel there is some aspect of the public expecting maybe they'll at least get something back from coming tax rises if it's Labour that will be spent on public services and may address some of their concerns about it. But people are split, you know, and it is also very easy for people to say, oh, I want to increase more spending on public services. Younger people, for example, who you might think they're a bit more Labour supporting, you might think they're more likely to support tax rises, but actually they're not. They're much more against tax rises, partly because they're often the ones bearing a brunt of a lot of the cost of living crisis. And when it comes to individual tax rises, it is really different. You know, people don't want basic rate of income tax going up. They would be worried about council tax going up. And it's much easier to persuade the public to support things like you know, an increase in the higher rate of income tax, for example, you know, or taxes on corporations or potentially wealth taxes than it is. But of course, we also know they don't necessarily raise as much money as some of those broad general personal taxes. So it will be difficult to get the public on board. I think the one thing the public definitely do not want to see is any cuts in public spending. And I think there's to some extent that maybe they're a bit more worried that would happen under the Conservatives than Labour.
Thanks, Gideon. Philip, as other panellists have mentioned, productivity is the other lever, perhaps the main lever that parties are hoping to be able to pull to improve public service performance. Let's talk a bit more about the role that capital has to play in that. We published our report, the NHS Productivity Puzzle, last year that really outlined, you know, serious opportunities around capital investment, whether that's in IT, kind of equipment and so on. What kind of opportunities are there to increase productivity?
So, enormous opportunities, actually. So if we looked at local government, for example, our modelling, as I've said already, looks at a sort of £6 billion gap between income and expenditure. But alongside that, with other colleagues in the sector, we've looked at some of the productivity gains that we think technology could offer. And aggregated across the whole local government sector, for example, we've sized that at 2 billion. But without a sort of substantive national programme of investment sitting behind that sort of technology, it's very difficult to capture those. So what we're not seeing is those national programmes come forward for, you know, in the same way that we did in 1997, for example. We're not seeing those national programmes of sort of renewal. So there's things like the new hospitals programme, but that's been sort of beset by delays. The sort of, you know, framework for delivery around that really hasn't got off the ground. But it offers an enormous opportunity. And if you look at hospital buildings, just sorting those sorts of estates out can produce massive productivity gains. The other interesting thing about capital investment, I think, is the other dynamic to investment in public services is economic growth and the extent to which large-scale investment in capital and public infrastructure can support getting economic growth. And getting economic growth is absolutely critical to obviously the spending forecasts that both parties have tied themselves to. If that growth doesn't come forward, they're even in an even deeper hole. So it wouldn't surprise me if in the autumn we see some of that capital investment and maybe something akin to the old, dare I say it, PFI, being one vehicle through which the government pursues growth. So I think those capital investment plans have to come forward if the government is going to be serious about public services.
Thank you. And then, Nick, one question for you, then I'm going to go out to the audience. It's a pretty bleak picture right across public services, but if there is any additional funding for a new government, where should they be investing it first? What's the most urgent piece?
Well, in terms of where, if they get to choose where to spend it, then I think they should be spending it in ways that are hopefully going to reduce future costs. One area for that is capital, in that you hope that you improve the productivity of services and you can deliver the same quality of services for less in the future. And I think the other one is to invest in prevention. So that acute demand in the future is lower than it might otherwise be, therefore meaning lower future costs. I think the slight irony on the kind of the productivity debate is that many of the efficiencies that were made in the 2010s were cutting back capital budgets, they were cutting back prevention budgets, they was holding down public sector pay, which led to lots of experienced staff leaving, which has made services less productive. And so I think the government is the framing of a 10-year plan, because it will take 10 years to fix a lot of these problems, and it will take, sometimes longer for the impact of some of these investments to show. We're still producing, or IFS has still, recently produced some really great analysis of the impact of Sure Start 20 years later. Sometimes it just does take a while for these investments to come true. But I do think that the government is going to be forced to spend some money in some places. So, the most expensive thing in public services are the staff who work there. The only high-profile strike action that's still ongoing is junior doctors, but there are a lot of other staffing groups, whether that's nurses, teachers, consultants, who are awaiting the outcome of the pay review bodies, which would have published but have been delayed because of the general election and the incoming government's response to those. And a lot of those groups have already called for above-inflation pay rises. And frankly, without those staff, and there are big recruitment, retention problems, never mind the disruption caused by actual strikes, that the government might feel it has little choice but to spend more on those.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, we're about halfway through, so I'm going to go out to the audience now. I'm going to take questions in groups of 3. Can I ask you to tell us who you are, where you're from, and can I ask for it to be a question rather than a statement, please? I've got one here, one here. There's a mic coming.
Thank you. I'm wondering, in reference to prisons, whether the IFG has actually looked at the makeup of prisoners. Years ago, for example, it used to be the case that young men started to grow out of crime when they got married, settled down, and stopped seeing their mates and causing trouble. Now young men don't get married in the same way, and there's much increase in immigration. Have you analysed the prison population?
Thank you. And then we had another one over here at the back.
Hello, my name is Jessie Harrington. I'm sorry I was late for the first part of the meeting. I just wanted to ask whether any of the parties have looked into tax fraud and evasion. That is, and how much would that raise extra if done properly?
Brilliant, thank you. Is there anybody else in the room who wants to ask a question? Otherwise, I'm going to take my third from online. Okay, we've got one there.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Harbi. I'm a retired nurse. I voted with my feet because I couldn't take it anymore. What I'm trying to say is the workforce is extremely stretched and many are leaving. They could be doctors who are leaving for Australia. There could be nurses who are leaving for other countries which pay better. I also understand that with the visa requirement which has been enacted already, there has been a drop of around 83% of overseas recruitment nurses. How are you going to try to bridge a gap in the workforce?
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So we've got prison population, tax fraud and evasion, and workforce challenges. Nick, I'm going to come to you first.
So on the prison population, the broad trend in recent years has actually been the prison population has got older over time, and actually that's put its own pressure because previously they've got more people with kind of Asian conditions which they're not set up to deal with. The big drivers in the last couple of years of the increase in the prison population has been the huge rise in the remand population, and that's because we have record backlogs in the criminal court, so people are being held there before their trial. And we've also got a big increase in the recall population, people who've been released but have been recalled back to prison. But the big long-term driver is sentencing. Over the last 15 years, sentences have been extended. So, for example, for a lot of crimes in general, now the automatic release date is at 2/3 of the sentence rather than half. And that is the big driver of increase. And that is why the incoming government is going to have to make some unpalatable decisions, because you either send people there for less time, or you let people out sooner, or you somehow find a way to kind of hold them before they go into prison. But none of those are great, particularly if you want to be seen as tough on crime. In terms of the wider workforce question, so I think that's a trade-off that neither party has been particularly open and honest about. As you say, particularly in health and care services, in hospitals with doctors and nurses, but also with GPs and in adult social care as well. Pretty much all of the increase in staffing numbers in recent years has come from those that we've recruited from overseas. It's been flat or declining for domestically recruited people. That is, great in that we can get a lot of skilled people with different perspectives from around the world. It can be some challenges because some of those people might be more likely to go home after a certain period. But it's also about kind of salary, because if you decide to cut immigration routes, which the current government has, and you want to fill that gap with domestically recruited people, then you need to pay them more, frankly, because domestically recruited people are not showing much interest in taking those jobs otherwise. And there is a trade-off between how much we want to pay for our public services and how much we want to staff them with people from overseas. And there's no right answer to that, but I don't think either party has been particularly honest about the trade-offs involved.
Sorry.
I don't have an awful lot to add. On the tax question, I do know, I don't have the numbers to hand, unfortunately, but I do know that Labour have announced that they are going to train and recruit more staff in HMRC to deal with tax avoidance. And they suggest that actually a lot of tax avoidance is accidental, or people who don't have the knowledge to sort of properly file their taxes. So they want to train HMRC personnel to spot when somebody might not be returning their taxes in the correct way. And I can't remember the figure, unfortunately, with how much they said that would raise, but it's definitely something that the Labour Party have said they're going to look into. And I think that was a couple of months ago they announced that. In terms of NHS workforce, I touched on that briefly in my opening remarks, because that seems to me to be one of these kind of political inconsistencies around the conversation with immigration, which is that when you talk to voters and they raise immigration as a point of concern, they say, I'm really worried about the impact it's going to have on the NHS, or I'm really worried about the impact it's going to have on my kids' schools. When the reality is actually a lot of immigration we have in this country has been really helpful for staffing in things like the NHS, in the social care sector, in the education sector. And when the Conservative government announced a crackdown on the number of health and social care visas, the first question that was asked was, how is this going to impact already dwindling numbers in the NHS? So you have to absolutely get that balance correct, and there is an important argument to be made that actually we should be ensuring that there aren't brain drains from other countries, that we're able to recruit here and pay health and social care staff properly. But I think we do need to reframe the conversation around immigration into the net positives it has as well, and I think you can especially see that in the health and social care sector.
Thanks, Zoe. Gideon?
I won't add much. Just on the workforce point, there is some. The public are also slightly inconsistent on this, as well as politicians. So the public are not keen on high levels of immigration for many of the reasons that Zoe just pointed out. But they are open in specific sectors. You can have an argument about increasing immigration for health being the most obvious area. But there is some openness there. You can make an argument about it, but it needs to be in the wider context of demonstrating that you have control over immigration and asylum, which obviously is not the same, but there is the public can sometimes kind of loop all these groups together. There is also some support for there is generally support for doctors, so the junior doctor, less so for consultants, but the strikes by junior doctors and for nurses, there is public sympathy out there. The public do consistently say lack of staff is a bit of an issue. So again, it just adds up to the difficult decisions facing any government. The only other extra thing I would add, the broader point, is I talked briefly about maybe we can think about sort of engagement with citizens and think about citizens' juries and things like that might be a way of bringing the public along with you to help think about how we tackle some of the difficult decisions. Obviously, that should apply to staff as well. There's an approach of like reaching out to staff and involving staff in some of these deliberative mechanisms to get staff views on how we can improve public services, and that can be a net positive.
Thanks, Gideon. Phillips, anything else?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. So Labour did make an announcement around tax avoidance and tax evasion and actually attached quite a big number to it, I think, as part of their spending plans. So I think there's a big opportunity through tech and AI, in addition to the recruitment of additional staff, to get after uncollected tax. But from what I've read and my understanding of that situation is governments always achieve less than they expect from that particular thing. And just on the workforce issues in the NHS, you seem to be alluding to getting out because of working conditions as well. When I spoke to colleagues ahead of this session, so Christine, who sat in the audience who specialises in NHS, one of the initial things she said to me is working conditions. So when we talk about workforce, it's not just pay, and so it's working conditions. And some of the things we've talked about around prevention, not addressing prevention properly, some of them, the nature of work and working conditions are affected to such an extent in the NHS that people don't see that as an attractive career and profession anymore. So that needs to be addressed as a priority as well, I think. And we're not hearing much about that at the moment.
Can I just add on that? I mean, pay is clearly the big issue, but as you say, there are things an incoming government could do to make staff feel a bit more valued. I think the current government's approach to strike negotiation has been very aggressive. It refused to talk to a lot of unions for a number of months. It then introduced the strikes bill, and I think that just adds more heat to the discussion, and I don't think that has particularly helped. And a new tone would probably help quite a lot. And then there were the little things, as you say, in terms of working conditions. When we speak to kind of doctors or nurses, they'll say things like, I gave a year's notice that I was getting married next year, but I couldn't guarantee on the rota that I wouldn't be working. And like those types of things don't cost a lot to fix, but they do make a big difference about how you feel about your work and your employer.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, we've got quite a lot of questions coming in from the online audience. Thanks to everybody watching. So I'm going to pose a few of those to our panel. Nick, I want to come to you first. A question from Sam from NCVO. What do you think it would take to convince any new government that upstream preventative spend would reduce demand on public services?
So there's a big question with prevention about the quality of evidence. And one of the things you often hear when you talk to those in government is, well, the reason we didn't do this was the evidence base wasn't very good for it, or the Treasury asked us for lots of evidence about the impact that it would have. But I honestly think that slightly overstates the issue. So there is better evidence for some preventative programs than there is for others, just as there is for acute programs as well. But often it is not although politicians and ministers are using evidence to support their decisions, often it is not a single piece of evidence that is leading to it. They have wider strategic priorities and they are making spending decisions with those in mind. So I think the key thing, if you wanted to have a shift towards prevention, is it needs political will, frankly. And in central government, that requires the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, because they are ultimately the people who are signing off spending allocations. And it requires being strong enough to face down the short-term political pressures that they are under, because the things that ministers are getting called about are why are ambulances waiting an hour outside hospitals? It's not why was this, great reablement program cancelled? And so, but they have to have the confidence that if they invest, it will make a difference. And actually, Sure Start is a really good example of that. It had a lot of support from Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, and if it didn't, frankly, the first evaluation of it wasn't that positive. Same with the Troubled or Now Supporting Families program, which was implemented by kind of David Cameron and George Osborne. The first evaluation of that wasn't particularly good, but it has shown to be impactful in the long term. So I think the key thing that is needed is political support. But there's lots of other things, and for ministers who are interested, I'd strongly recommend reading the report on this topic that we published last month.
Great plug, Nick. Philip, quite a few questions on local government coming from the online audience. Local authorities are facing significant financial difficulties, but it doesn't feel like this has been much on the agenda in the campaign so far. Why do you think that is, and what steps will the next government have to take to stabilise the sector?
I don't know necessarily why it's not been covered hugely. I guess there's always a tendency to focus on national issues. I don't think the next government can ignore it because I think we've had 6 Section 114s up until now. I think there's 13 authorities in receipt of exceptional financial support currently. That will just continue unless this situation is addressed in a really meaningful way. That I think means an entire overhaul of the current system for local authority funding. And I think Labour will have to address it if they come into power, because local government will be a key delivery partner for lots of the things that they want to achieve. So unless there's the capacity and financial capacity for local authorities to deliver, then this is going to have to be addressed. That then comes back onto council tax. I think inevitably we will see changes around council tax. Maybe not the system, but maybe some of the capping will disappear. Because I think authorities need to be able to raise more money. And when you have seen authorities go into Section 114, some of the council tax increases have been pretty eye-watering. So I think that now will happen across the full sort of landscape of local government. So they will have to address themselves to it, otherwise we're going to see more failure. And this sort of talk of a Sue Gray list of catastrophic events, I think local government financial failure features pretty highly on that.
Zoe, why do you think local government hasn't featured so much in the campaign so far?
Well, I mean, Labour's spoken or did speak quite a lot about devolution and its plans for more kind of localised powers in towns and, local authority mayors and things like that quite early on. But I think when it comes to actually sort of narrowing down your political campaign, you kind of want to talk in terms that are quite easy and quite simple for the electorate to latch onto. So talking about devolution doesn't grab the voters' attention, even though it is very important and it does have some real-term impact. I think people are worried about council tax rises, just like they're worried about any kind of personal tax rise. When we have a cost of living crisis, people really don't want to be spending more than what they've already budgeted for. But I do think that there is political will in Labour to give more money to local give more power to local authorities to make their own decisions. And I actually think if you kind of read between the lines of what sort of Starmerism and Starmer's Labour is, it is about communities and it is about local power. And so I do think we will probably see those kind of things happening, maybe not right away and maybe not as the kind of basis of the Labour's campaign, but I do think they're on the horizon. We've seen that set out in the way they talk about towns and communities.
Thank you. Gideon, and probably Nick, you'll want to answer this too. We've talked quite a lot about taxation so far. Is there any evidence, what is the evidence base that suggests that increases in taxation would actually translate into improved public services?
from a public opinion point of view or from a reality point of view? I suspect maybe I'll let Nick answer the reality. I mean, the public don't just think it's about increased spending. I mean, they do want increased spending, but the public also want reform and changes to the way that public services do things, particularly in terms of, you know, how easily accessible they are, how available they are, how they deal with people. So it's not just about money from a public viewpoint, but money is definitely a key part of it. I think maybe more the point I can say is that it's easier to, it is very hard, say, so there is a kind of classic disjunctive between the public. So they want to see more spending and they want to see better public services, but it is obviously difficult, particularly at a time of real pressure on cost of living, where many people find it really, really, really hard at the moment. And, you know, having to skip, you know, like make real difficult savings just to be able to pay off their regular bills. Mm-hmm. To kind of persuade people that you also need to pay more in personal taxes is, not unsurprisingly, it's a difficult ask. It is easier if you can talk about, for example, as Gordon Brown did, with his NHS budget, if you can make it very, which the Treasury doesn't like, hypothecated spending and taxation and things like that, but if you can say this is to go on the NHS very, very clearly, particularly around the NHS, that is an easier sell than just broader rises, and, you know, particularly on things like council tax or basic rates of income tax, which people just do not like, unfortunately.
You know, I think all else being equal, a better funded service is likely to be a better performing service, but all else is very rarely ever equal, and there are clearly better ways of spending money than others. You know, for example, I think you're much more guaranteed to see a long-term service improvement from investing in capital, and within capital budgets, probably within the maintenance budgets, rather than kind of building new things, than from revenue spending. You know, there are the big example in hospitals. There's been a relatively big increase since 2019 in spending on hospitals. We've recruited a lot more doctors and nurses, but that has not translated into a commensurate increase in activity in hospitals because of productivity issues. But they probably would be performing worse without all that additional money and funding. So I think it's probably better to think of funding in some cases as a prerequisite for service improvement, particularly as it requires headroom to make decisions. It requires headroom to invest in the long term rather than just dealing with short-term crises. And it requires, frankly, the management and leadership headroom to oversee, because actually I think most of the productivity improvements that you could see in public services, and there are a lot of productivity improvements that could be made, are much more likely to be made on the front line by people who understand how those services delivered, what the actual demand for the service is, how that changes over time, and how they could improve the flow and working of that service. But to do that, you need the time and space that not many frontline workers have at the moment, and that requires money often. Thanks, Nick.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the room. If there are any more questions, then please put your hand up. I've got one here, and then one. So, thanks.
Oh, you're very sweet. Thank you very much. I'm Andrew Edwards. I'm a PhD student. I just wondered, following on from my colleague's point here about prisons, is whether or not there's any money behind the sofa. For example, the prisons budget is apparently $2 billion underspent because the government can't get prisons built because local authorities won't grant a prison place in their area. And so that is why they're going to take the power away from local authorities to be able to block these issues. I took my friend to A&E on Saturday. We were seen within 20 minutes of arrival at Whittington General by a doctor, by a real, proper, qualified doctor. From 20 minutes, we checked in and he was treated, right? So I simply wonder whether or not, again, from what you say, it's the various experiences that people have around the country, because that is where we're not getting a uniform picture. You might think it's bad, but depending on where you are, it's not actually quite as bad.
Brilliant, thank you. And then one here.
Thank you. Maria Rita Circi. Do you think that this is still appealing for the electorate to promise tax cuts when even after the cuts announced in the last autumn statement and spring budget taxes are their highest level?
Thank you. Okay, so we've got money behind the sofa, kind of underspend. How uniform is the experience, and tax cuts? Who wants to jump in first? So I don't know why I'm looking at you.
That's okay. You made a really interesting point about things being built in this country, and there has been a huge problem with projects being blocked by local authorities. Not just prisons, we've seen it with housing as well. And one of the things that Labour is going to do is actually, for want of a better phrase, stand up to the NIMBYs. It's talking about reforming planning laws, but also talking about things like compulsory purchase orders to make it easier for councils to buy land and to basically get Britain building again. Whether in practice this is easily done, the planning system is incredibly archaic, complicated. There are lots of invested bodies in keeping it the way it is. We were talking about how Labour wants to hand power back to local authorities, but with that you get, local people saying, actually, I don't want a new prison in this area, or I don't want a new housing development. But I think it's absolutely integral to the productivity of this country to get things built. So hopefully Labour can implement some of those planning reforms and get those projects built. The other point on tax cuts, whether the public have any more appetites for tax cuts. Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have implemented, is it now 3 or 2 consecutive national insurance cuts and 1 more promise? They don't move the political dial at all. There was no uptick in support when there was a national insurance tax cut, partly because the amount that people were receiving from their tax cut didn't really cover the cost of the energy bill hikes or the cost of their groceries going up, but also because actually, for all the reasons that the panel have set out, people see the state of public services and they wonder if their money shouldn't be better spent. So I don't think the public... Income tax is a slightly different proposition. There is an argument that people might be more in favour of an income tax cut than a national insurance tax cut. But actually, what people want is their public services to be functioning properly. And I think when you talk about sort of, between £50 and £100 a month back, it's not money to be scoffed at, but in the general scheme of things going up, inflation, cost of living, not being able to get an NHS appointment, your kids' schools, ceilings falling down, it doesn't move the political dial. It doesn't seem to bring back support for the Conservative Party.
Gideon, I wonder whether you wanted to come in on the tax cuts question as well.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't moved the dial, particularly for the Conservatives. I think that is at least as much around broader attitudes to kind of like the damage of the Conservative brand, to doubts about whether maybe even if they might take the money, but would it be spent competently? What sort of difference it's going to have, and also about wider issues about who does the public blame for the fact that inflation is so high in the first place, which is not just the Conservatives, but the Conservatives do get some of that blame. And so I think that's partly as much why it hasn't had an impact. I think you have to be careful about assuming that it's not a vulnerability for Labour or that people are sort of desperate for more tax cuts. There are a lot of people who are finding it really, really difficult, and any sense of a rise in personal taxes could genuinely make it harder for people, and people will also worry. There will be a level of anxiety about it. The 2,000 tax increase line that Sunak used against Starmer in the debate, it did. From sort of qualitatively watching it, we sort of had people watching some of these debates. People were concerned about. Even if it doesn't necessarily change people's mind about the Conservatives or necessarily, but it did make people worry. So there is people are clearly concerned about public services, but some of those arguments around increasing personal taxes, they will cause some worry for some groups, particularly younger people.
Thanks, Gideon. Okay, I want to end with a question that I'm going to ask every panellist to answer very briefly. We've got 2 minutes left. That comes from the online audience. On the one hand, we have a political system where the incentives point to the short term, because we see systems run on electoral cycles. At the moment, we have, a series of really acute pressures in public services and beyond. And of course, the nature of the political cycle is there are also crises in that period that require immediate attention. But on the other hand, a lot of the problems that we're seeing right now require systemic, long-term change, whether that's on public services, growth, whatever else. How do you reconcile that challenge, Nick?
I mean, I think there's always a temptation, particularly when working in a think tank, to try and come up with the one institutional answer that is going to create long-term stable policy that's going to improve everything. And while there are things that can help, certain institutions like the OBR, for example, have definitely been beneficial. Ultimately, it always comes down to the quality of political leadership and political will, and there's very little that you can do without that.
Thank you. Gideon?
Yeah, I mean, I think Nick is very right. There isn't an easy answer. The short answer is there isn't an easy answer because you need to do a bit of both. But insofar as you can, you need to have the political will, you need to be engaging with the public, you need to show that you are delivering on their concerns. Obviously, it's great if you can have some short-term improvements to show the benefit of it. But otherwise, it's you have to take people with you, and you have to address some of the wider points that, for example, some of these changes, they are being done fairly. For example, there is some sort of procedural justice and procedural fairness. People have been involved. It's an accountable decision. You're transparent about it. Some of those things can help as well.
Thank you. Philip?
So really tough, and I think we've probably gone backwards in regards to short-termism. So we don't hear about National Infrastructure Plan anymore. It's probably evidenced by cancellation of HS2, which was that did have cross-party support. That then disappeared. So just I agree with all the points that Nick and Gideon would make. Devolution potentially offers some reason for optimism. So if you look at places where devolution has worked quite well, Greater Manchester being one, they've been quite long-termist in the approach they've taken. They've managed to keep that sort of coalition together, cross-party, and delivered some real change there. So perhaps devolution, in a meaningful sense, everywhere, could offer some hope in that regard, maybe.
Thank you. Zoe?
Oh, yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think just to build on what's already been said, I think government needs to build back public trust. There's been a series of scandals that have eroded public faith in politicians and whether they do things for the correct reasons. And I think to bring the public along with you for a long-term plan, they need to trust you. And some of that is in showing you're responsible with money, but some of it is also in character and showing that you care about the public and you listen to them, but also that you are made up of a group of politicians with good, genuine, will and motivations. And I think that's something that the people don't really feel anymore. You hear on the doorsteps people say, I just don't trust politicians. And it has got, it's always been quite low, but it has got worse, I think, ever since the expenses scandal, but then a series of things after that. So one of the things that I know Labour is going to do, it wants to create a body to look into kind of integrity in public life and standards. And I think that's one small step to restoring faith in politicians.
Brilliant. Thank you, Zoe. Really interesting set of answers on that last question. So we need committed political leadership, people of the right character, taking people with you and making decisions and putting power in the right places. Okay, I think that is all we've got time for. In fact, I think we've slightly overrun. So just to say a big thank you to Grant Thornton for making this event possible, to our brilliant panellists for a great discussion, and to the audience both in person and online for your questions and engagement. Thank you very much.